Hello Year 10, Lesson 8 of Adaptations and Ecosystems. Let's go. So we're going to be looking at why are humans so bad for biodiversity, and we mentioned biodiversity before. We're going to be looking at the effects of pollution, deforestation and global warming and what that's doing to our range of amazing species that we have on this planet. So we've mentioned biodiversity before, like I said, just to highlight what it means again, it's specifically the number of different species. So you could have loads and loads and loads of one thing, but that's not particularly biodiverse. So you need to have lots of different types of living thing living there. So it could be plants, animals, insects, bacteria, everything that's alive. But the more different types you have, the more biodiverse it is. And obviously that's quite useful in terms of cycles and things, which is what we've been studying in terms of the carbon cycle, etc. before. So I want you to have a think, maybe jot down some notes. Are the human species affecting biodiversity? Do you think we're increasing biodiversity? Do you think we're decreasing biodiversity? And how specifically, so what activities are we doing to actually cause these changes? Whichever way you think it is. So pause the video and make a few notes. So you might have guessed that we're doing a bit of both. Some better than others and some worse than others kind of thing, depending on which way you look at it. So let's look at how we're reducing biodiversity, so how we're possibly wiping out or endangering certain species. Big factor, pollution, specifically on land, water and air. So air pollution by burning those fossil fuels, releasing sulfur dioxide, we're releasing acid, it's dissolving in the rain, and then we're having acid rain. Water pollution with our sewage, all that sort of stuff. Land pollution, our rubbish, plastic, building, lots of issues in terms of pollution going on that we are doing to cause this reduction in biodiversity. So land in particular, we can be talking about those buildings and how that might actually destroy habitats, but also how it can be affecting the cycles as well. We poach and hunt, obviously not us particularly individually, but certain cultures find a reason to poach or hunt specifically endangered species now. So for example, there's a Chinese medicine that they believe comes from rhino horns. So what rhinos are being poached and hunted, and we're trying to do what we can to try and protect them, but those numbers are declining. Deforestation. So not only is that actually wiping out specific tree species anyway, it's also reducing shelters and habitats and causing problems within things like the water cycle and the carbon cycle, which will obviously affect biodiversity as well. We've got the destruction, degradation and fragmentation of habitats. So if you imagine you've got to build a road, and you obviously want roads to be as quick as possible from getting from A to B, you may need to go through a forest or through a particular sort of field, in which case you might be splitting up two different groups of species or two mating animals, and if they can't get to each other, then they won't be able to breed and numbers could decline. So you could think of it in quite simple terms like that. And finally, we are actually introducing invasive species, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. So for example, we might bring something in to deal with a pest that is currently a problem. So that you might bring in an animal that will eat that animal or hunt that animal, and eventually that invasive species could become a problem. It could find another food source and try and eat that instead. And then you obviously get a decline of that number of populations by accident. Also, with it, it could bring disease that could cause problems as well. So it's not just obviously consuming the other species, it could also be a more widespread issue where a disease gets brought in as well. It's not all bad. We have recognised that we are not doing the best for biodiversity on our planet. We are trying to do some things to improve our biodiversity. So we've got breeding programs, specifically zoos. Bristol Zoo is a brilliant example of a breeding zoo. Endangered species can get brought in and breeding is encouraged. If it works, then their offspring can be sent somewhere else to breed with a different one. And so you end up with a bigger gene pool so that not everything ends up interrelated, which can obviously have issues genetically. We are protecting endangered habitats. So we've got lots of things like national parks being sort of marked and protected, and we put a lot of taxpayers' money into sort of protecting these areas. We've also got safari parks and wildlife parks in other countries, in place like Africa, for example, that people pay a lot of money to go to, and that obviously helps with some of our more endangered animals. We're replanting hedgerows. Now, a while ago, we used to have quite small fields, but as population numbers have increased, we've needed to grow food at a much more bigger rate, faster rate. So what they did was they made fields bigger so they could grow more of one thing much more easily, especially when they started getting machinery like tractors, etc. in. So these fields with these hedgerows were removed, like their kind of partition bits were removed, and those hedgerows were actually where things like small rodents would live, like little rats and little little field mice, insects, birds. All of those hedgerows got completely removed. They also were not great to remove anyway because they help bind the soil. So other insects that live in the ground would also find that the soil was changing and they would struggle as well. So by replanting these hedgerows, we're bringing back a new habitat, and we're also making the fields a bit smaller so that insects and things in the ground can happily populate. We're reducing the rate of deforestation. So they've got a really clever way of doing deforestation. Obviously, number one, we're trying to replant whenever we chop things down. But we've also got, if we are doing deforestation, there's a specific sort of method to it where they don't just chop down everything in their path. They will map out sort of circle areas. And within that circle, if you imagine a clock, they've got a bit in the middle of the clock which they won't touch. That's kind of native and it will always be there and they will never chop it down. So it's kind of like a core that is protected. Then around it, they have segments. So if you imagine like a clock between 12 and 1, they might chop down that section. However, the next time they come to, once they've cleared that area, they will not chop down between 2 and say 4 o'clock. They will leave that alone. They will do between 4 and 5 o'clock, for example, and they'll clear that area. What that does is any of the animals or anything that was growing in section 12 till 1 that can move quite easily into the 2 till 4 section. So shelters are still provided, habitats are still provided, mating pairs might get split up, but there's more of a chance of them being able to find each other or find another mate. While they then chop down 4 to 5, 12 till 1 will be replanted. Also, it could even be naturally replanted by the trees around it, by the core that never gets chopped down, or by the sections between 11 and 12 and 1 and 2, for example. So they're trying to reduce the rate of deforestation by doing it in a very kind of controlled manner, but it is obviously happening at a very quick rate anyway still. By not using raw resources, by using recycled materials, that can massively improve biodiversity because we're not reducing any of the resources that other things might need. So, for example, if we use deforestation again as an example, if we can recycle furniture, if we can reuse our furniture, then wooden furniture, in particular the plastic, then we won't need to chop down other trees. So that obviously helps with the habitats, etc. So, why are we actually creating more pollution now than ever? It's particularly an issue because of how much our global population has increased. It is exponential. Because we've got so many more people, not only do we physically need to house these people and place them in places, and that obviously means that animals and plants will have less space, there's also more of a demand on other resources. So fossil fuels, everyone needs heating and powering in these first world countries. So more fossil fuels get burnt, that increases the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's a big cycle there that's not particularly positive. And we also need to use more of our land for food to be grown. So you can see that vast areas of land are being changed from being natural and habitats for lots of animals and plants, and they are being changed into fields and agricultural use. Also, by tarmacking and lots of cement for industry and housing, that's also causing issues for things that live in the area. So not only are we taking over these things, we're also then producing more waste, and that has to be managed, which can also cause big problems for other ecosystems. In particular, we're going to focus on water pollution. So water pollution can be because of needing more food. Farmers will use fertilizers to encourage their crops to grow more quickly or bigger. And if it rains or just naturally, the fertilizers can get flushed into rivers and lakes and all sorts of other sort of small water ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems. And what will happen is those fertilizers will encourage growth, and you'll end up with something called eutrophication. I'll talk you through that a little bit more detail in a moment. But also, if you think about the opposite end, most of our sewage also ends up in water type environments. So we treat our sewage by adding microorganisms to the water that the sewage is in. Microorganisms basically decompose the sewage, but because they're living things, they respire and they use up all the oxygen in the water, and that can cause issues for other living things in the water, and they die, and it's not particularly great for biodiversity. So if you just pop back to this eutrophication, which is an issue because of fertilizer use. So the fertilizers gets rushed into, or flushed, sorry, into a river or lake or pond, and mainly the plants grow particularly well because obviously they are plant-based fertilizers, and they grow like crazy and everything's happy. The fish have got some more food to eat, all that kind of stuff. However, what then happens is you also get algae that does what we call an algae bloom, and you end up with this kind of layer on top of the water, which is a greeny layer, which is algae growing, and they're trapping all the sunlight, they're growing, they're happy, and they will cause like the sunlight to be blocked from getting down to those big plants that grew at the beginning. Also, by creating this layer on top of the water, the algae is blocking oxygen from being absorbed into the water for fish as well. But also algae respire, and they will be using up the oxygen that is in the water. So things start to decompose underneath this layer of algae. And annoyingly, decomposition also uses oxygen. So any oxygen that is left will be used up by those decomposing microorganisms, and they will cause no end of issues for anything that's still alive. So what happens is the entire ecosystem reaches a point where the oxygen levels cannot sustain life or can't provide enough oxygen for respiration for anything else in there. So you have the death of the ecosystem. Pretty much everything else dies. And it's a really sad situation to be in, obviously, and it does take a little bit of time, but it does happen quite frequently. And most people think it looks beautiful, this like lovely green lake, but actually it's a dying ecosystem. So we haven't done much 6-mark answer practice in this topic, so I thought maybe we should do some. But I'm going to give you a hand, so don't panic. I would like you to pause the video in a minute and actually try this yourself, but I am going to give you some pointers so you kind of have a starting point. So the 6-mark question could be something like, how can humans reduce the impact of their activities on biodiversity? So we're looking at what we're doing to try and stop the badness of what we've done to damage biodiversity. So what are we doing that's positive to try and improve it? So just to highlight or remind you, different ones you can be talking about are the breeding programs, protecting habitats, replanting hedgerows, deforestation regulations. We didn't talk much about this, but the governments are doing quite a lot to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to try and reduce global warming, and also recycling. So we talked about those earlier, and to get 6 marks, you can choose any 3 of those. Outline it briefly, so what is a breeding program, but then what does it actually do to try and improve biodiversity? So have a little go. You can do it in bullet point form. I am very, very keen for 6-mark answers to be in as easy a format as possible. You don't have to write in full sentences in your exam paper. Lots of people think you have to, but you don't. You can do it in table form, or you can do it in bullet points. As long as you get everything out that you need to, then that's fine. So pause the video and give yourself a chance at answering a 6-mark question, please. So the sort of thing you probably wrote, or hopefully wrote, are if you chose the breeding programs, it supports or encourages breeding within endangered species so that population numbers increase again. You could go on to then say, these animals could then be released into the wild and then hopefully they'll be able to sustain themselves. We protect our habitats these days, so we're setting up national parks so that the homes, or habitats and food resources are all protected. We're replanting our hedgerows so that the borders around the fields are now replanted and bringing back habitats and a little bit more biodiversity in that area again. The deforestation regulations. A key word I didn't mention earlier was the word felled. That's when you chop down a tree, if you didn't know. So you fell a tree. The careful planning and how it encourages organisms to move rather than just removing their habitat completely and then they die. So it's kind of giving them a sort of second chance. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So we've got lots of agreements with governments trying to reduce their carbon dioxide being released by all of their industry, but it's particularly to protect habitats such as the Arctic sea ice for polar bears. We can talk about that. And finally, recycling. So rather than using those raw materials and reducing pollution, we can use these materials again in a different way. So it stops other living things that might require those resources from being at a disadvantage. So hopefully you can see where the 6 marks comes from. You only need to mention 3 different ways. You need to tell me what the way is, give me a little bit of description of it, and how specifically it actually helps to encourage a better biodiversity. So you are going to use that answer, by the way. It's not completely useless within this writing phase. So hopefully you've written something fairly decent, or if not, at least corrected it so you can use it in this section. So for the grades 1 to 2 task, what does biodiversity mean? So tell me what we mean by biodiversity. So biodiversity means. And then for grades 3 to 4, what are we doing that's negatively impacting biodiversity? And then you can increase sort of up to grades 5 to 6 by actually telling me how it causes a reduction in biodiversity. So you can do grades 3 to 4 and 5 to 6 combined if you prefer. It's kind of in the same style as how we did the 6-mark question, but obviously we're looking at the negative impact in grades 3 to 4, 5 to 6. And then for grades 7 to 9, we're evaluating these steps that we're trying to take to reduce the negative impact. So use your 6-mark answer, improve it if you can, but the evaluative bit is always going to be a mark available for you to say what you think and why. So tell me which ones you think are working and why do you think they're working? What evidence do you know or can you think of that would show that this particular process or particular technique is working? So pause the video and off we go. Grab a different colour pen, tick it, correct it, add extra detail, you know the score. So what does biodiversity mean? It means we're specifically looking at the different number of species, not just how many of one there is, it's the different variety. For grades 3 to 4 and 5 to 6, I've paired it up like this. So we're doing a lot of activities that cause pollution. So land such as quarrying, buildings, they destroy habitats. The water, the fertilizer and sewage causing eutrophication. The air, we're burning fossil fuels, causing acid rain, all that sort of stuff. We're poaching and hunting, which is obviously killing endangered animals and then they can't go on to breed. Deforestation, not only is that obviously reducing certain tree species, but we're removing habitats. The destruction, degradation and fragmentation of habitats means that breeding pairs might not be able to reach each other, for example. And lastly, introducing invasive species. We could be killing off one species, which then would disrupt the whole ecosystem. So if you think back to those food webs, they could obviously cause a huge impact wider than just the one species being killed off itself. So feel free to add some more detail if you need to explain your grade 3 to 4 points that you've made. And then finally, for grade 7 to 9, I've just recopied the answers for the 6-mark question there. It's not anything new, but make sure you have also included your opinion. And it is your opinion, but you do just need to have a little bit to back it up. So you can't say, I think humans are reducing the impact they're having on reducing biodiversity. You need to say why. So you could say, let's choose one of them. Protecting habitats by setting up national parks or a safari wildlife protected area in Africa, the number of lions has increased in the last few years, something like that. Or you could say in breeding programs that they've successfully bred different species. I don't know what's been a really good one recently. And they have a baby rhino, I think they had recently, and they also had a polar bear as well. So you can talk about those kind of examples to actually back up your opinion. All right, choose your today I achieved sentence. So today I achieved explain, for example, because I could describe the ways in which human activity has a negative impact on biodiversity. So choose the one that's best for you. Pause the video if you need to. As always, don't forget the 10-question quiz on Show My Homework. Make sure you go back, complete the quiz, and we'll obviously email out to parents. Remember, you've still got 3 attempts, but do your best. See you next time.